My name is Sarah. I'm 28 years old, and I still remember the exact coldness in my mother's voice when she told me to pack my bags and never come back, all because I chose to wipe the brow of a dying man instead of sitting in a glass office. The room felt like an icebox as my own flesh and blood looked at me with pure disgust. I walked out of that house with nothing but a suitcase and a shattered heart, entirely unaware that the frail old man I was sacrificing everything for was secretly writing a document that would make my family choke on their own cruel words. Growing up, my family was absolutely obsessed with status and money. My mother, Linda, a 55-year-old real estate agent, measured a person's worth entirely by the brand of their car. My sister, Emily, 32 years old, was her golden child, a ruthless investment banker who looked down on anyone in the service industry. They expected me to get a soul-crushing corporate job and marry rich. For a while, I tried to play their game. I got an entry-level job at a prestigious marketing firm, and I hated every single second of it. I would sit in my cubicle feeling a suffocating emptiness. One evening, I had a complete breakdown in the office bathroom. That night, I confided in my best friend, Jessica, a 29-year-old nurse. She gently suggested I needed a career where I actually helped people. Taking Jessica's advice, I started looking into healthcare and caregiving. I volunteered at a local senior center on weekends and instantly fell in love with it. Listening to the stories of the elderly, holding their hands, making them smile, it filled that dark void inside of me. I made the terrifying decision to quit my corporate job and take a full-time position as an in-home caregiver. That was how I met Mr. Arthur Harrison, an 82-year-old man who lived alone in a massive, dusty old house on the edge of town. The agency warned me about him. They said he was grumpy, difficult, and had chased away 3 other caregivers in the past month. But when I first walked into his dimly lit living room, I didn't see a monster. I just saw a profoundly lonely man who was in a lot of physical pain. The day I told my family about my new job is forever burned into my memory as the worst night of my life. We were having dinner at my mother's pristine, overly decorated dining room when I proudly announced that I had quit marketing to become a caregiver for an elderly man. The silence that fell over the table was deafening. My mother dropped her fork, her face turning pale before twisting into absolute fury. Emily actually laughed, a cruel, mocking sound. She asked if I had really thrown away an education to wipe an old man's backside. I tried to explain how fulfilling it was, but they didn't want to hear it. My mother stood up, her eyes blazing with rage. She told me I was an absolute embarrassment to the family name. The argument escalated into a screaming match. My mother told me that if I walked out to be a glorified maid, I was no longer her daughter. She pointed a shaking finger at the door and told me to get out. I stood there, tears streaming down my face, waiting for my sister to defend me, but Emily just looked away. They were throwing me away. I packed my bags that very night, my hands trembling as I threw my clothes into a suitcase. I drove to Jessica's apartment, crying so hard I could barely see the road. Jessica took me in, made me tea, and held me while I mourned the loss of my living family. It was a brutal realization that their love for me was entirely conditional, based purely on my income and social status. The next morning, with swollen eyes and a heavy heart, I went to Arthur's house. I poured all of my grief and energy into caring for him. Every morning at 6, I would help him out of bed, prepare his medication, and make him his favorite blueberry oatmeal. I would bathe him, dress him, and read the morning newspaper out loud while he sat by the window. My routine became my sanctuary, a safe place where I didn't have to think about the family that had thrown me away like yesterday's trash. Arthur was tough at first, always complaining about the temperature or the food, but I never took it personally. I would just smile, adjust the thermostat, and ask him about his past. Slowly, the thick walls he had built around himself started to crumble. He told me about his late wife, his days serving in the military, and the small logistics business he had started from scratch decades ago. As the months passed, we formed an incredible bond. I moved into the guest room of his house to provide round-the-clock care because his health was rapidly declining. We spent our evenings watching old black and white movies, sharing bowls of popcorn. For the first time in my life, I felt truly appreciated. He didn't care about my resume or my clothes, he just cared about my company and my kindness. Meanwhile, the silence from my family was absolute. I tried calling my mother on her birthday, but the call went straight to voicemail. Emily had blocked me on every social media platform. The rejection stung, a dull, constant ache in my chest that flared up during the holidays when it was just me and Arthur sitting by the fireplace. I was entirely alone in the world, except for this frail old man who was slowly filling the massive hole in my heart. One rainy Tuesday night, Arthur had a terrible coughing fit that wouldn't stop. I had to call an ambulance, and we spent a terrifying night in the emergency room. As I sat by his hospital bed, holding his fragile, wrinkled hand, I started to cry. I was so scared of losing him. Arthur looked at me with these tired, knowing eyes and asked why my family never came to visit, why I was always alone. I broke down and told him everything. I told him how my mother and sister had disowned me because I chose to care for him instead of working in a fancy office. I told him about the cruel things they said, how they called me a worthless servant. Arthur listened in silence, his grip on my hand tightening slightly. He softly whispered that they were blind fools and that I was worth more than gold. For the next year, Arthur's condition worsened. He was moved to home hospice care. The days were grueling, filled with oxygen tanks and sleepless nights. I barely left his side. I spoon-fed him when he was too weak to lift his arms. I sang to him when the medication caused terrible nightmares. It was exhausting work, but I did it with love. Exactly 2 years after I had walked out of my mother's house, Arthur passed away peacefully in his sleep. I was sitting right beside him, holding his hand as he took his final, quiet breath. The grief that washed over me was suffocating. I had lost my best friend, my surrogate father, my entire world. The house felt unbearably empty and cold without his grumpy complaints and warm smiles. I handled all the funeral arrangements myself, paying for a beautiful, modest service out of my own small savings. Not a single person from my past life showed up. It was just me, Jessica, and a few of Arthur's old neighbors. A few days after the funeral, I was packing my bags, preparing to move out of Arthur's house and figure out how to restart my life, when my phone rang. It was a man named Mr. Davis, a 60-year-old attorney who introduced himself as Arthur's lawyer. He requested my presence at his office the following morning for the reading of Arthur's will. I was confused. I assumed Arthur had left everything to some distant relatives or a charity. I certainly didn't expect to be involved, but I agreed to go out of respect for him. When I arrived at the grand law office downtown, my heart almost stopped. Sitting in the waiting chairs were my mother and my sister. They looked me up and down with smug expressions. Emily was wearing an expensive suit, and my mother had her designer handbag. I felt a wave of nausea hit me. What were they doing here? I later found out that my mother had been keeping tabs on me through mutual acquaintances. When she heard that the rich old man I was caring for had died, she dragged Emily to the lawyer's office, assuming I was going to be left penniless and homeless. They were there to watch me fail, to gloat, and to offer me a humiliating way back into the family on their strict terms. Mr. Davis called us all into his massive office. He sat behind a heavy oak desk, adjusting his glasses as he opened a thick folder. My mother leaned forward, a greedy glint in her eye, expecting to hear about the massive estate going to a local hospital. Mr. Davis cleared his throat and began to read Arthur's final words. The room was dead silent, the tension so thick you could cut it with a knife. He read Arthur's words out loud. To the family of Sarah, who threw away a diamond because they preferred cheap plastic, I leave absolutely nothing but this lesson. To Sarah, the only person who treated me like a human being in my final years, I leave my entire estate, my home, and total ownership of Harrison Logistics. Emily jumped up, her face bright red, screaming that this was impossible. Mr. Davis slammed his hand on the desk, demanding order. He confirmed the details. Arthur's company was worth millions, and it was now mine. My mother suddenly changed her tune. The fury on her face melted into a desperate smile. She reached out to touch my arm, her voice suddenly sweet, saying how proud she was of me, how we were family and should celebrate together. I stood up, looked her dead in the eye, and told her not to touch me. I reminded her that she had called me a worthless servant. I told them they had made their choice 2 years ago, and now I was making mine. I walked out, leaving them humiliated in the dust. Taking over the company was the hardest thing I have ever done, but I was determined to honor Arthur's legacy. Within 2 years, the logistics company expanded its operations. Profits soared. My mother and sister tried relentlessly to crawl back into my life with apologies and requests for jobs. I instructed my security to escort them out. I changed my number, moved into Arthur's home, and severed all ties with my biological family. The pain of being disowned was a necessary fire that burned away the toxic elements of my life, making room for a miracle. Arthur gave me my dignity and a future where I make the rules. It makes me wonder about the true cost of chasing status over human connection. Would you do the same in my place? Until the next story.